Well, to discuss the implications of this RAF drone strike in Syria, I'm joined by Professor Michael Clarke, Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, which is a defence and security think tank, and also by Charlie Winter, Senior Researcher at the Quilliam Foundation, which is a counter-extremism think tank. Good evening to you both.
Good evening.
Yes, hello.
Hello, Professor Michael Clarke. First of all, what makes this killing quite so remarkable?
The fact that it's an extrajudicial killing, which the British have always said that they don't use their drones to do this. They use drones, armed drones, to strike in Afghanistan, but it was always in support of British troops or in other ISAF troops. It was in the war zone. So here a drone has been used outside a territory in which we're engaged in warlike operations. It's an extrajudicial killing, as was said, and of course it's rather jumped the parliamentary gun. There was always an assumption made pretty clear by Parliament that any bombing in Syria would be authorised by Parliament, and this is the Prime Minister seems to imply this is a one-off thing, but nevertheless it's an attack inside the Syrian border in a way that I think has taken a lot of people by surprise.
But the Prime Minister suggested that this was an act taken in self-defence, and also that statement by UK officials that they might act if there was a critical British national interest at stake. Presumably the government would argue that was the case in this instance.
Yes, and I think that will have to come out. I'm sure the Prime Minister is going to be questioned on this pretty closely over the coming days and even weeks, that for a self-defence justification to really stick, then there has to be a threat which is somehow fairly direct, fairly manifest, not just a generic threat that this man was a terrorist, and also that the threat was imminent and that there was no other way of dealing with it. Now, all those things may be true, but people will ask, and it's quite unusual, I think, for a British Prime Minister to have to justify an act like this in the way that he may have to justify it in the coming days.
Charlie Winter, what sort of reaction do you think there might be among other jihadis in the UK, or indeed those who've left the UK to go and fight for IS in Syria?
Well, I've been looking quite closely at the reaction among jihadis in Syria right now, and they've been quite subdued. I mean, he's had very few mentions, whereas back when the reports were first emerging that he had been killed, there was a lot being spoken about. He was a prominent fighter by all accounts. But predominantly, the real thing that jihadis are talking about at the moment isn't this. They're talking about refugees. That's their key issue at the moment. And they're showing pictures of refugees arriving in Eastern Europe and the awful things that they're being put through there. And then they're also showing Islamic State propaganda, showing refugees being welcomed there. And it's a very striking set of pictures that we're seeing, but far and away that is the predominant issue.
Do you think it will have a resonance, though, the killing of one of their own by a drone strike in this way? Is that a danger, that this is somehow putting the situation onto a much more visibly war footing than we've seen until now?
I don't doubt that there will be some mention of it, but I don't know how striking and big a reaction they'll have, because this is Islamic State that we're talking about. They don't see the boundary between Iraq and Syria, so that the UK is engaged in strikes above them in Iraq, but not in Syria. They don't really recognise that difference. The fact that it's a drone, that probably will have some reverberations, but again, it's very difficult to know this early on what the reaction will be.
Professor Michael Clarke, though that same division, that same boundary between Iraq and Syria might well be regarded as mission creep by many MPs and indeed other commentators in the UK.
Yes, it will, because last October, when the British joined the American actions to counter IS, the Parliament made it very clear that they were authorising action in Iraq, but not in Syria, and legally, action in Iraq is absolutely straightforward. The Iraqi government has requested aid is being provided, no legal problem. There is a very good case for extending the operation to Syria, a good legal case, but it has to be made. You don't have to make the case in Iraq, but you do have to make the case in Syria. And so here we are with an intervention in Syria in a way that I think MPs will find quite surprising, and the case will have to be made.
There has been some suggestion that this could be, to some extent, paving the way for another vote in the Commons on that very question. Do you think that's likely?
Yes. The assumption was, back in the early part of the summer, that the vote would be pretty well any time after the 12th of September. Once there was a new Labour leader installed in office, then there would be a vote. And the assumption was, back in June and July, that that vote would go through reasonably straightforwardly. But since then, it's clear that the Labour Party is not at all happy about it, and a Labour Party led by Mr Corbyn, I think, would be in a different sort of circumstance. So I think that a vote with a Corbyn-led Labour Party is very hard to call, and it may be quite chaotic in any case. So I suspect the government wants a vote, because I know that the government wants to extend the action to Syria, and there's a very good set of reasons to do that, but it won't be easy to get clean, clear parliamentary approval for it.
And Charlie Winter, just to return to the two men who were at the centre of this strike, who died, Reyaad Khan and Ruhul Amin, did they have high profiles within IS?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a relatively small clique of British fighters who have been very active on social media, and they've been very active in trying to recruit other people, selling the so-called caliphate and saying it's a utopia and that these things that you're seeing in propaganda are actually real. But beyond that, it's very, very difficult to actually know how important they were within Islamic State as an organisation. And that's why I think it'll be very, very interesting and important that more information does come out about this, because at the moment, if there's not that much open source that indicates that they were engaging in, or on the cusp of engaging in attacks. So it's very important that there is an inquiry into this.
Charlie Winter and Professor Michael Clarke, thank you very much indeed.